The Zyathian homeworld shimmered under 1,000 moons, its crystalline spires glowing faintly in the twilight. In the royal chambers, Princess Xalira sat motionless, her sharp claws tracing the edge of a datapad. The screen displayed images and reports of Commander Dren Thal, the human warlord she was being forced to marry. His face, rugged and scarred, looked like it had been carved from stone. Every line in the dossier confirmed what she feared. Humans were creatures of war, a species born to conquer and destroy. She exhaled sharply, her breath catching in her throat as she scanned his history. Battles upon battles, victories written in the blood of enemies. It was said that his strategic mind had outmaneuvered some of the Zyathian fleet's best commanders. But worse than his military prowess was his reputation for ruthlessness. To Xalira, the thought of uniting with someone so merciless made her insides churn. "Your Highness, the delegation will arrive tomorrow," an advisor's voice interrupted her thoughts. She didn't turn to face them, keeping her gaze on the datapad. This union is not just a marriage. It is survival. Without the humans, the Empire cannot hold against the Graltech incursions. Xalira's tail flicked in irritation. "And so, I am to be sacrificed for survival?" "Not sacrificed," the advisor corrected, though their tone lacked conviction. "Strengthened. Humans may be unorthodox, but they are loyal once bonds are forged." Her claws dug into the armrest of her chair. Words like strengthened and bond did little to alleviate her growing anxiety. She had grown up hearing horror stories about humans, their capacity for violence, their cold pragmatism. For her, those stories were now embodied in one man. Later that evening, she stood before the grand windows of her chamber, looking out over the Zyathian capital. The city, with its flowing rivers of bioluminescent light, had always been a source of comfort. Tonight, it felt distant, as though she were already leaving it behind. The weight of duty pressed heavily on her chest. Her family had made it clear. This was the only path forward. "Princess," a soft voice called, pulling her from her thoughts. Her younger brother entered, his antennae twitching nervously. I heard them talking. They said the human is dangerous." "Are you?" "I am fine," she cut him off, though her voice wavered. "We do what we must for the Empire." He hesitated, then reached out to touch her hand. "You've always been brave, Xalira. Braver than anyone I know." She smiled faintly, appreciating his attempt to comfort her, but the truth remained. No amount of courage could erase the dread pooling in her stomach. The following morning, the sky above Zyathian darkened as the human delegation's ship descended. Its sleek, metallic design stood in stark contrast to the organic curves of Zyathian architecture. Xalira watched from a distance, her heart pounding. Her future was stepping off that ship, and she wasn't sure if she was walking toward peace or a predator. The air was tense as the human delegation disembarked from their vessel. Xalira stood at the edge of the grand reception hall, her ceremonial robes flowing around her. Her sharp, golden eyes locked onto the figure leading the group. Commander Dren Thal. He was taller than she had imagined, his broad shoulders and imposing frame exuding authority. His face bore deep scars, remnants of countless battles, and his expression was unreadable, his jaw set firmly. Beside him, his officers stood with practiced discipline, their movements precise and deliberate. The humans were clad in stark, utilitarian uniforms that contrasted sharply with the ornate elegance of Zyathian attire. Everything about them seemed calculated, efficient, alien in its simplicity. Xalira's heart raced as the commander's gaze swept the room before landing on her. For a moment, their eyes met, and she felt a chill. His expression was not one of hostility, but of calm detachment, as if he were assessing her the way he might a battlefield. When the formal introductions began, the hall filled with the hum of translated voices. Dren stepped forward, bowing slightly, a gesture that was neither overly submissive nor overtly disrespectful. "Princess Xalira," he said, his voice deep and measured. "It is an honor to stand before you." His words were polite, yet she detected no warmth in them. She responded with the carefully rehearsed lines dictated by her advisors, her voice steady despite the unease coursing through her. "Commander Thal, we welcome you to Zyathian. May this union bring prosperity to both our peoples." As the formalities progressed, Xalira couldn't help but scrutinize him. Every movement he made seemed deliberate, almost calculated. Yet, there were moments where his gaze softened briefly, as though he was holding back something more human beneath his rigid exterior. The tension rose during the ceremonial exchange of gifts. The Zyathians presented an intricately crafted artifact, a crystalline sculpture symbolizing unity. When it was handed to Dren, he paused, his brow furrowing slightly. He murmured a few words to his aide before addressing the Zyathian hosts. "This is a remarkable gift," he said, "but in human culture, it is customary for such exchanges to be mutual. We regret that we arrived unprepared for this tradition." The hall grew silent. The Zyathian customs dictated that a refusal to offer a gift in return was a slight, no matter the intention. Xalira felt the weight of every gaze on her, her claws digging into her palms. Before the tension could escalate further, Dren took a step forward. "I hope this can suffice as an offering for now." He unhooked a small, unassuming medal from his uniform, holding it out with both hands. "This was given to me after a campaign where we protected civilians during an evacuation. It holds value not for its material worth, but for what it represents: preservation of life. I offer it as a symbol of what I hope our alliance will stand for." Xalira's breath caught. The gesture was unexpected, almost intimate in its simplicity. The Zyathian officials murmured among themselves, their initial offense giving way to cautious acceptance. She studied him more closely as the moment passed. His face remained stoic, but there was a flicker of something genuine in his eyes. For the first time, she felt her fear waver, replaced by a sliver of curiosity. As the meeting drew to a close, Dren turned to her. "I understand that this situation is unique for both of us. I hope we can find common ground in time." His words were measured, yet they carried an undertone of sincerity. Xalira nodded stiffly, unsure of how to respond. She watched him leave the hall with his delegation, his movements precise and purposeful. The man she had feared as a ruthless warlord now seemed more complex, layered in ways she hadn't anticipated. But she wasn't ready to let go of her skepticism. Not yet. The sound of footsteps echoed softly in the private chamber as Xalira sat across from Dren. The ornate table between them was adorned with holographic displays detailing the upcoming union. For the first time, they were alone, with no advisors or guards to mediate their interaction. Xalira kept her gaze steady, though her claws lightly tapped the edge of the table in a rhythm betraying her unease. Dren seemed unaffected by the tension. His hands rested calmly on the surface, his posture upright yet relaxed. He studied her for a moment before breaking the silence. "I understand this arrangement is not ideal for you," he said, his voice even. "It wasn't my choice either." His bluntness caught her off guard. She had expected empty platitudes or rehearsed diplomacy. Instead, his words felt strangely disarming, almost honest. "You speak plainly, Commander," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "I've found that honesty saves time," he said with a faint shrug. "Our circumstances don't leave room for pretense. You think I'm ruthless. I won't deny that my decisions have often been harsh, but they've always been made with purpose." Xalira tilted her head, her golden eyes narrowing slightly. "Purpose? To conquer? To dominate?" "No," he said firmly, leaning forward just slightly. "To protect. To survive." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "I've read what your people think of us. The stories of humans as monsters, as predators. But do you know what humans fear most about Zyathians?" Her brow furrowed. "Fear? Of us?" He nodded. "Your strength. Your elegance. Your precision. You've been painted as untouchable, perfect beings. To many of us, you're not monsters. You're something we can't ever measure up to. The admission was unexpected. For a moment, Xalira found herself at a loss. She had never considered that humans might view Zyathians with anything other than suspicion or hostility. You speak as though you've seen this fear yourself, she said cautiously. Dren's eyes darkened slightly. I've seen it. I've lived it. When I was a younger officer, I led a small squadron during an engagement against a Zyathian fleet. Our ships were outmatched in every way: technology, strategy, firepower. The only reason we survived was because the Zyathian commander decided we weren't worth the effort to annihilate. His hand brushed one of the scars on his face, almost absently. That was the first time I realized just how fragile we are. Humans fight because we have no other choice. It's messy, brutal, but it's what keeps us alive. Xalira studied him in silence, her initial impressions of him beginning to shift. The scars she had once seen as symbols of aggression now appeared as marks of resilience. His words carried weight, a sincerity she hadn't anticipated. You've killed many of my people, she said, her voice quieter now. And yet, you sit here, speaking of survival. Do you truly believe this union can erase that history? Dren shook his head. It won't erase anything. But it's a start. We can't undo the past, but we can decide what the future looks like. There was something in his tone, something almost vulnerable, that made her chest tighten. He wasn't what she had expected. The ruthless warlord she had feared was, in reality, a man who carried the weight of his choices with quiet resolve. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that there was more to Dren than his reputation. The sharp sound of metal striking against crystal shattered the quiet atmosphere. Xalira barely had time to react as a cloaked figure lunged toward her, a blade glinting in the dim light. In an instant, Dren moved, his reflexes honed by years of combat. He stepped between her and the assailant, catching the blade on his forearm. The sound of fabric tearing mingled with the hiss of pain, but he didn't falter. With a swift, calculated motion, he twisted the attacker's arm, disarming them with a precision that was almost mechanical. The cloaked figure staggered, but before they could regain their footing, Dren delivered a decisive strike that left them crumpled on the ground. Blood seeped through his sleeve, but he didn't spare a glance at the wound. Instead, his eyes scanned the room, ensuring there were no additional threats. Xalira's heart raced as she stepped forward, her instincts as a royal suddenly taking over. Her hands moved deftly, activating the security field that sealed the chamber and alerted the guards. She turned to Dren, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "You're injured," she said, reaching toward him. "It's nothing," he replied gruffly, brushing off her concern. He retrieved a small device from his belt, scanning the unconscious attacker. This wasn't random. They knew exactly what they were doing. She frowned, her claws flexing in frustration. A noble faction, most likely. There are still those who oppose this alliance. They see it as weakness. Dren's jaw tightened, but he didn't comment. Instead, he handed her the device, which now displayed the attacker's identity. As she studied the information, she felt a wave of anger and disappointment. "One of my own," she murmured. "I should have expected this." "You can't control everyone," Dren said simply, his voice calm despite the situation. "But you can send a message. Show them that their actions won't deter you." She looked at him, his face still composed despite the fresh blood staining his uniform. There was no hint of accusation in his tone, only practicality. For someone she had once considered a ruthless warlord, his words carried an unexpected reassurance. Moments later, the guards arrived, taking the assailant into custody. As the chaos subsided, Xalira found herself sitting beside Dren. He had removed his jacket, exposing the wound on his arm. It wasn't deep, but it would leave another scar to add to the collection. "You didn't have to shield me," she said quietly, watching as he bandaged the wound with practiced ease. "It wasn't a choice, He replied without looking up. "Protecting you is part of my duty." "But why?" she pressed. "You gain nothing from it?" He paused, his hand stilling for a moment. "Because alliances don't start with treaties or ceremonies. They start with trust. If I can't show you that I'm willing to stand with you, then this union means nothing." Her gaze softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to truly see him, not as the enemy she had feared, but as a man who carried his burdens with quiet strength. When the time came for the ceremony, Xalira stood beside Dren, her heart steady in a way she hadn't expected. The words they exchanged were carefully crafted for diplomacy, yet as she spoke them, she felt a new sense of conviction. Dren's hand brushed hers as they completed the ritual, a small, deliberate gesture that was both grounding and symbolic. As the room erupted in applause, she glanced at him, her fear replaced by something else entirely. Perhaps trust wasn't built overnight, but for the first time, she believed it was possible.